Hello and welcome to this month's LinkedIn Live with Shape Talent. We call these LinkedIn Lives Breaking Barriers because once a month we get together with key players who are concerned about gender equity and breaking barriers, and we get under the bonnet of EDI issues. Why do we care? Well, we are Shape Talent. My name's Rachel Schofield. I'm one of the senior facilitators with Shape. And Shape is an award-winning consultancy and training provider in the space of gender equity. We work with global multinational organizations who are serious about gender equity. But the LinkedIn Lives are a chance for us to dig into some of the big topics. And I'm delighted that joining me today is Jen Barnett, who is the head of equity, diversity and inclusion and ESG at Grant Thornton, UK. And rather than me do all the intro, Jen, I know you've got many strings to your bow as somebody who is also a trained psychologist and executive leadership coach. But tell us what brings you into the world you now work in.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Delighted to be here. So yes, my name is Jen Barnett. I head up ED&I and ESG for Grant Thornton professional services firm. So what we do is we advise clients around tax, audit, some big complex financial transactions. And we have about 5,500 people in the UK, and then we sit globally across a number of different countries as well. So yes, big role. And I came into the role predominantly because I'm interested in people and culture change and behaviour. And those skills led me into a role focused on ED&I within my organisation. So you're absolutely right, Rachel. I'm a trained psychologist. I also spent quite a bit of my career in cultural intelligence type roles, so working for BAE Systems and British Airports Authority in the run-up to the Olympic Games, where my role was really to influence and shift and change behaviour in quite complex change environments. And I've come to Grant Thornton, and before I was head of ED&I was head of people experience. So you could argue a similar skill set in terms of what influences behaviour and what influences culture change. And a lot of that I've brought into this role, and we've now integrated ESG into that. So very much the S of ESG in my role. What does it mean? What are we standing for? How do we make our business really sustainable? And also, crucially, how do we ensure that it's commercial and that it's long-term in its focus?
Brilliant. And we're going to get into with you the whole topic of behaviour and culture. We've called this month's LinkedIn Live, how can you build a culture that enables the attraction and retention of women? Such a big issue, and one that has complexity, because often we talk about the practicalities of EDI, about flexible working, about parental leave, some of the things you can implement at a practical level. But as you said, as someone who's interested in people and behaviour, accessing a culture, creating a culture in which women can thrive and diversity and equality can really prosper is probably much harder than just saying, right, we'll put in a policy. So that's what we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about that for about 25 minutes. And I want to just say that everybody listening, I'm doing the questions, yes, but we would love your questions as well. So I will keep an eye on the comments. And if you have questions for Jen, or you have comments, things that resonate, that we chat about, experiences or insights you want to share, please do get involved in the comments, either live or if you're watching on the replay, we would be delighted. And I will certainly make a little bit of space after about 25 minutes for questions if I see any in the chat. But Jen, with this issue of people's behaviour and culture, what is where you tend to start? You came into an organisation to work exactly this, and I know you very quickly saw some areas of priority, starting off particularly with kind of buy-in at a top level of getting your senior leadership and your executive committee really involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is ED&I is complex, and for anyone that works in the space, we know it's complex, it's emotional, and it's also multifaceted, and it requires real serious investment across a number of different pulls and levers in an organisation. So you talked about policy change there, and that is one of the levers that you might pull. If we're going to look at this from a system change, which is really where, if you're really going to make progress in inclusion and diversity, it needs to sit. I think there are three things that are really important. I think the first is around who leads ED&I. So you talk there about what's the first thing that you would look at when you were looking at culture change within a business. I would always start with, how are you creating board accountability around some of the key agenda items that are important to you? So that was an area where, when I first came into role, really focused on that. And there were a couple of levers I pulled around board accountability. I think the first was around, why is this important? Why would a business want to focus investment and time on ED&I? And actually, why would they want to take deliberate action? And you only need to, I'm sure lots of people on this call have read lots of reports, but we recently published our Women in Business report for 2024, and we've been publishing the same report for a number of years now globally. And what that has shown is that actually there has been an increase in senior positions held by women in organisations, but that progress has slowed down over the last 4 years. And you could make lots of suggestions about why that is. I think COVID has had an impact on that, but it has slowed. What we have found is an increase in CFOs and HRDs at board level who are women, a slowdown in the number of CEOs, particularly in the FTSE 350, who are women in those roles. So I think what that's saying is that this is really hard for organisations to keep working on and to keep pushing all of the time, and it's a long-term agenda. So unless you get board accountability for that, and the board's responsibility is about the long term, it's about the sustainability of the business, it's about how you overcome those barriers to promote really good working cultures. It's about the legacy that you want to leave behind as a leader. What is that? And how are you getting the buy-in to that? And it's also about, how do you make your business really commercially successful? So we know from the reports that, I don't know if you've read the Forbes reports, are really interesting one. Very happy to share that with people who are listening on this call. But that looked at decision making in businesses, and it looked at proof points around those decisions, and it looked at 600 different businesses and different decision points. And what that came up with was that if you are making a decision on your own, you make good decisions 50% of the time. If you're making them in a group, but that group is, if you're a male, it's all male, you make better decisions 70% of the time. But then if you add women into that group, you make better decisions 80% of the time. So what that's suggesting is that you do make better decisions when you make them with other people, and that the more diversity you can bring into those decisions, the better those decisions will be. So it's not just about the optics about what this looks like. It's actually, you make better decisions, you attract clients, you have better client affinity around their problems, and also it can create greater investment in innovation, greater investment in risk taking and quality control. So lots and lots of reasons why you'd focus on this, but it's really pinning the business case down for that. And what I found was that in each business that's different. So in our business, we had specific things that we needed to focus on. In another business, they might be different. So it's really about, what is it that's important to your business, and why you choose to focus on it. I think that's the first thing to do, really.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that really kind of getting clear on the impact, the long-term results for a business, and getting buy-in on that, and not just focusing on the kind of the targets and the numbers, but thinking, what does this actually mean for our business? Why does this make good sense is important. I know you also mentioned about that sense of buy-in from senior leaders, that you have to, one of the things that you made sure you did is making sure everybody is responsible for DE&I, and that it doesn't get kind of siloed and one person has to kind of carry all of it and everyone else can be like, that's not my issue.
Yeah, my and it still is, I think, one of my objectives is ultimately to make myself redundant in the role that I'm in, because I don't think you can really embed I&D into a system if you have one person controlling it and managing it and running it. And that is the sense that it's a bit like quality in an organisation. Everybody owns quality, and that improves the quality. Everyone's responsible for it. They know what they need to do. They've got objectives around it. They've got targets. but each and every person is responsible for quality. It's a bit like ED&I, unless each and every person almost has it in their job description to say, what's my responsibility for this? Where can I be progressing it? You know, am I doing enough in terms of my succession planning and my pipeline activity? If I'm a leader, am I doing enough around my behaviour to encourage a culture where everybody feels included and everyone feels safe to speak up? I just don't think you can be successful in creating an inclusive culture if one person's controlling it. So what we did right at the start was we set up each board member to be accountable for a strand. So a strand for us is gender or ethnicity or social mobility. And then they appointed a convener. And a convener role was somebody who's partner level in our firm, so very senior in our organisation, whose responsibility it was. They have a lived experience. So, for example, in social mobility, we have a partner who's in charge of social mobility who has a lived experience of coming from a very low socioeconomic background. And what that does is it means he can be a role model for that and talk about that in a very real way because he has lived that. And he can also be the voice piece in the business for decisions that are made and thinking about how those decisions are made that might impact on people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So what it does is it's creating ownership or shared ownership of the I&D agenda, because that person is really driving the social mobility agenda. So yeah, right at the start, we said, what's the structure we need to create to enable ownership? And those people have job descriptions, they're accountable for their actions, they account to the CEO at the end of every year to say, what impact have you had? What are you trying to create? How has that helped? What are the barriers? And then their board sponsor is responsible for getting rid of those barriers and helping those areas to progress. So where they have challenges, it's actually unlocking those challenges. So that's something that we put in really early on to kind of rid the organisation of some of those barriers that exist, and only people in power can do that.
Yeah. And dare I ask, and I ask this knowing that you've spoken about it, I know a post that you made on LinkedIn, there was a quote from you that said, Grant Thornton has relentlessly focused on inclusion, made mistakes, and worked out what's been effective. So I know you're bringing with you a wealth of things that perhaps didn't always work or that have been tough.
Yeah.
So, for example, when you came up with that idea and said, right, everybody needs a piece of this pie, everyone needs to what did you learn from that in terms of if people are listening, thinking, oh, I'd like to try that, what should I watch out for, or what could have been done even better? Do you have any learnings about how that did work out and perhaps where you could have done it differently or little nuances you had to make?
Yeah, I think, well, you're learning all the time, aren't you? And I think sometimes with ED&I, it's the courage to take like small calculated risks. It's the courage to take risks to enable things to work. And when we originally put the model in, people didn't really understand the role. They didn't understand the model. So it took a while for people to really get to grips with the role. And I think the other thing is that if you're asking people to do something side of desk, it can quite often get pushed to one side because it's side of desk. Whereas what we want to do with ED&I is to make it front of desk. So when we originally put the model in place, what we weren't very clear on is what's the reward around this? What are we taking off this partner to ensure that they have this as front of their desk and not side of desk? So that's taken a while to develop. And actually, if I'd done this differently right at the beginning, I think that's probably something I would have thought about, is how do you really embed this as front of desk and make it really important. But that has grown in importance over the 5 years that I've been working on the agenda. And I think the other thing is that getting time with the board to really agree your strategic priorities. So we did set targets right at the beginning. I'll probably come on data in a minute, but we did it. What we probably didn't do with those targets behind the scenes for our sorry, my screen just went off there and I got a bit distracted. Can you still hear me?
Slight issue, but you're still with us.
Oh, good. So So yeah, so I think the targets that we set, we actually revisited those a couple of years later, and we got more people involved, the actual decision makers who were making decisions over who they're going to hire, who they're going to promote, who they're going to sponsor and put through. So we set targets a little bit in isolation when we first set them, and we didn't get the buy-in for those. And the second time we did it, when we recalibrated what our targets would be a couple of years later, we actually really invested in working with our business to understand what they needed and whether they were likely to get it. So I guess that's another real key learning, is get the right people involved early on.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jenna. Thanks for kind of going there with us, because it's so helpful for people to realise as well, particularly people who maybe are at a lesser level of maturity in the ED&I space, of kind of where the possible pitfalls are, where some of the really kind of powerful achievements are. I know one of the other things you've talked about when it comes to building this culture, which is going to attract and retain women, is getting serious about the data-driven approach, that you're tracking your key metrics. But I know I sense that you have mixed feelings, because yes, you need to be across the data, but you don't necessarily want to let it take over.
Yeah, I think I will be honest, I was quite anti-targets when I first took on the role, because actually I thought targets, there's a slight danger that if you don't get your targets quite right, they can potentially drive the wrong behaviour. And you know, it's checking for that and putting the checks and balances in place, and really making sure that whatever you're measuring are the things that you really want to happen, and they don't have unintended consequences. As I've developed in role, I have become more pro measuring and actually having that data-driven approach, because it allows you to track progress, and it also allows you to create ownership of the challenges. The other thing that it's really done is it has allowed us to look at the intersectionality of ED&I, and it's really helped us to learn and understand where we need to target specific interventions that will make a difference. So we don't tend to have broad brush approaches anymore. We tend to go into the data, target where there might be a problem, and then those projects are the things that the team are working on to help make improvements. So I wasn't necessarily a big fan at first, but I think as I've developed in the role and realised the importance of that to kind of drive behaviour and to drive action and to drive efficiency around that action, I actually think data is really crucial. And the reason I say about intersectionality is because what we realised with looking at our data, we actually measured people from low socioeconomic backgrounds and how they were progressing through our firm through data. And then we layered onto that gender and ethnicity. And what we found was there was a compound impact effect. If you were from a low socioeconomic background and you were a woman and you were ethnic minority, it was harder for you to progress because of internal barriers, triggers, and also probably some external barriers as well that our action plans are all addressing. If you were from a high socioeconomic background, and say you went to Eton as an example, and you were a man and you were ethnic minority, it wasn't as difficult for you to progress in the organisation because you had those kind of invisible networks and ways of getting around, and the work allocated to you in the right way, and you knew how to respond in certain client meetings, and you just knew how to behave in those environments. So it was really getting to grips with what are the key issues that are causing the challenges with progression within our firm, and how are we going to address that. So the data's really helped with the getting on piece. So our strategy is getting in, getting on, and belonging. And it's the getting on bit, I think, that the data's really helped us to hone our actions around.
It was reminding you, listening to me, Jen, our very first LinkedIn Live, and it will be sitting on the platform. So people do go and have a look. Back in January, I spoke to a couple of my colleagues, our founder, Sharon Peake, and our research guru, if I can call her that, Priscilla Pereira. And we were talking about women in STEM, and we were talking about data and the fact that data is great, but you have to know what to measure. And I think that's what a lot of organizations do, is they get all the data, and they go, yeah, here are the figures, great, but they're not looking at the right things. And as you say, there's real devil in the detail. So perhaps I wonder if you have any thoughts for companies, again, who may be starting out with this. Where do they need to, the intersectionality piece sounds really interesting, but are there other things where people could get sort of shiny object syndrome, that actually they're better not looking at that, but really focusing on this?
I think it goes back to deciding with your board what's important to you. Once you've decided on what's important to you, what the impact is, then you can go back a step and say, right, what outputs will help us to measure that impact? So that's what we did. And actually for us, the outputs were that we wanted more senior people at partner and director level, because that was one of our challenges, that we've got a really good pipeline up until that point, and then it starts to fall away. So we knew that was a big issue for us. So that's what we set targets around. We also knew we had a big issue, particularly around social mobility, with people declaring. So we had a big percentage of prefer not to say around our social mobility data, which does hamper our ability to look at any success because we just didn't have the data. So part of that was around belonging and trust and encouraging people and understanding what we were using it for, and also getting really granular about why we were asking the questions on social mobility, quite frankly. Yeah. So I think it's really important that you have an understanding of what you're trying to achieve first before you set any targets, because otherwise there's a danger you set the wrong ones. And I think it can lead you down a path of then, you fix one problem, but that you inadvertently cause another.
Yeah, really interesting. I want to pick up on a point you made earlier around when you were working with board members, and you talked about involving people who had lived experience. And I know that one of the other things that has worked well for you at Grant Thornton with thinking about attracting and retaining women, creating a culture that supports that, was storytelling and using storytelling as an influencing tool. I'd love you to say a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's I think this is you asked me what kind of the levers were for change. And I think the first one that we talked about there was who leads the ED&I efforts and really getting the board accountability for that. I think the second one, which we touched upon around data, is that clear strategy, having that in place, knowing what you're trying to achieve and how you measure it. And then I think the third one, which is where storytelling really comes in, is changing the culture. How do you change a culture? How do you get people involved? How do you help people to feel psychologically safe and able to speak up? It's actually having really powerful role models at senior level who are prepared to tell their story to influence change. So it's real people. So I'll give you an example of that. We have something called GT Live, which is everybody's invited in the whole firm, and it's an hour and a half at once a quarter, and it's business update. We actually happen to have GT Live on the 14th of June, which is Social Mobility Day. And our convener for social mobility interviewed our CEO and our COO, so the two most senior positions in our firm, both of whom have come from a very low socioeconomic background. And so he asked them, what were the things that were barriers for you? How did you overcome them? How do you feel about that now? And our CEO was really so generous and our CEO, both of them really generous about their stories, like the impact that it's had, how they overcame that, what sort of things they did to help themselves, how they became resilient, what were the really positive things that came out of that background, how did they support themselves. So having that ability to be able to have senior people willing to tell their stories, I just don't think can be underestimated how important that is to building a culture where people feel able to be themselves and talk about those things in the right way.
Yeah. And I guess when you're looking for buy-in again, which is another issue people sometimes struggle with, connecting an idea, a concept, a policy to a person can be very powerful. And I recall when you and I were chatting previously, when you were introducing the use of pronouns, which we know some people have struggled with and some people push back against. Again, you used storytelling. I remember you saying that worked very well, that when you had somebody say why that was important to them, people were much more receptive to like, okay, I can get my head around that.
Yeah, so one thing that we did right at the beginning, which had a massive impact on, I think you would say there's head and heart, isn't there, that influences change, and it had a massive impact on heart, was we put in place a pilot scheme around reverse mentoring, and we put our board through it first. Each of our board members had a reverse mentor, and the reverse mentor that was mentoring our CEO, their pronouns were they, them. They were non-binary in gender, and they talked about the impact of misgendering and how that impacted their mental health, how that impacted their belonging, why that was important to them. And it had such an impact on the CEO that he asked that person to come and speak at the partner conference to all the partners about their background, why gender was important, why gender pronouns were important, why we should be respectful of that, and the difference it made. They did that. They were nervous. They did it. They did it in front of all the partners, and there was they got a standing ovation at the end because the partners were so moved by this individual story, and it was so open and honest and raw. And I'm not a massive fan of like bringing out people with lived experience and saying, right, you fix the problem. Like, I'm not a big fan of that at all. But I think picking your moments and having people who are prepared to tell their story in a way that connects the heart can have a big impact, but it needs to be in a supportive way. And for this, it was supported by the CEO, because he was like, I need you to do this. This is going to make a big difference. And it did. And so they were prepared to do it. But the emotional toll that takes on people who have that lived experience, we can't underestimate that, but it can shift it if it's used in the right way.
Yeah, thank you. And it's great to sort of talk through some of these ideas, and the fact, as you say, that can be very powerful, but it has to be done in a way that's supportive, and you're not sort of putting the burden of explaining it all and making it happen on that person. Yeah, very, very interesting. Thank you. Let's talk about allyship and sponsorship, and the idea of sort of where other people fit in, where men fit into all of this. Because again, I think you have structurally created, I think it was called your Inclusion Advisory Board, where you're trying to get sort of people telling their stories, getting involved who perhaps otherwise wouldn't have a voice in this, and therefore bringing others in and making those allies.
Yeah, I think I think the challenge with ED&I sometimes is that you inadvertently, because you're focusing on trying to improve the lived experience for those people who are underrepresented in the workplace, you sort of forget about those people who are represented in the workplace and what they can do. And so it's very easy for them to feel powerless and therefore disengage from the agenda. So we put a lot of effort into allyship right from the beginning. So we have about over 400 inclusion allies in our firm. And shout out to Inclusive Employers, because they were the ones that helped us to build that program and run it. And also what we talk about with allyship is it's situational awareness. It's the everyday things that they notice that they can change. So it's kind of putting the power back into individuals to say, if you see a woman being talked over in a meeting or their idea not being taken forward, like, amplify the idea, talk up the idea, make sure it's heard. That is just one really small example of how you can be an ally. Make the person feel that you've actually heard their idea. Might not agree with it, but it's about being heard. And I think also that's about shining a light on the barriers that exist for women. And the other thing I would say about allyship is it's really helped us to move some of our policy decisions forward. So I personally don't think you can get to gender equality at work until you can enable gender equality at home. So we spent a lot of time looking at, well, what can we do about paternity? What can we do about really highlighting men who are responsible and who have care and responsibility? What can we do about flexible bank holidays and flexible working to ensure that it's helpful for everyone? So that kind of sense of allyship is how is everyone responsible for this and what can they do? And I think that's really important when you're looking at change.
Yeah, and I guess helping everybody see the benefits. We had a very interesting LinkedIn Live previously, I think it was back in February, with Robert Baker, who's actually on our advisory board at Shape Talent, and he does a lot of work in the allyship space, and talking about, that men need to see that it's a win-win, actually, that when these things change, there's a knock-on, especially for men who are dads, who've got girls, they suddenly see it in the round, and it's not a sort of, oh, I'm losing out because women are getting more help or whatever it might be. So
I think that's very true. And I think there's this whole piece around if women win, then men lose. And I think that's a rhetoric that we need to shift, because it is a myth, because we're at different starting points. So all we're trying to do is level up that starting point to ensure that it's fair. But I do think there is this win-lose mentality a little bit around ED&I. And what we're trying to say is actually everybody wins. And if you look about the future and you look about how businesses are setting themselves up for the future, if you look at AI, for example, or some of the geopolitical or socioeconomic tensions, there are a lot of big business issues and complex business issues that need to be faced into. And I think it's about bringing everyone together collaboratively to solve those problems, as opposed to one person feeling that they're responsible for it all.
We've got just a few more minutes left. I'm keeping my eye on the comments. If you have a question, please do put it in, or if something that Jen has said resonates, you're doing something similar, then we'd love to hear about it. But just as we're sort of come towards the end of our time. I've got a couple more questions. Sponsorship. Sponsorship is something we feel really strongly about at Shape Talent. And when we work with organizations who are running women's leadership programs, we, generally speaking, always work with them to create a sponsorship program. And I know that you at Grant Thornton have lent heavily into the idea of often sponsors can make a big difference to a culture where there is equality and actually we are retaining and promoting women.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes back to the kind of point that we talked about earlier, which is around, removing bias from work allocation and changing the system. I think you can only really do that if you're in power, like if you have the power to change that system and if you have the power. So we have done a lot of work on work allocation in terms of the system fairness. We've changed our systems to enable that, particularly in audit. What is really important to recognise in that bias is around how people, managers in particular, can make decisions based on affinity bias or collective bias or all of those other biases that exist in our heads. So how do you shift that? And I think with our sponsors, we've worked on, it's a deliberate role. You need to be progressing people, opening up your networks, thinking about how you get them in front of the right clients. Like it's an active, deliberate role. It's different to coaching. It's different to mentoring. It's like really being the voice of that person when they're not in the room. Like, how do you make sure that they're being advocated for when they're not around? So that's a lot of work we've put into our leaders around that sponsorship program has been really helpful.
You mentioned there as well, my ears pricked up, the idea about spotting and removing bias from work allocation. Could you say a bit more about that? That something that we need to watch out for when people are being given tasks or roles is something to be mindful of?
And it is the exclusion inclusion cycle, isn't it? So if you're not picked for the really exciting, great work, we tend to pick the people for that, or the high risk work that we know, that we get on with, that we trust, that we've worked with before. Absolutely fine. What that means is that this affinity cycle of, if you don't get picked for really good projects or high risk work, you don't get noticed, and therefore you don't get performance reviews, feedback that you need to be able to progress, and you don't get the learning and the growth. So work allocation is kind of where it starts, and it's looking at that and saying, are you picking the same person for the same jobs all the time, and is that why they're getting promoted, and is that why they're progressing? So it's just challenging and questioning ourselves. And I actually think this is where AI can really help us, because I think it can look at all of these systems, and if we can get AI right, it could really help us to remove some of that human bias that exists when we're doing things like allocating work, because it can really help us to think about the fairness of those decisions. But I think we're quite a way off that yet, but it would be great to see it.
Yeah, and it's making me think about, some of this is about challenging ourselves from a mindset perspective, spotting our own bias, helping people spot their bias, but also that kind of what gets measured type thing, that piece about the data again, and actually capturing those things. Yeah. We could talk so much about these, but I can see a question has come in from Sharon, who's our founder at Shape Talent. Jen, are you able to say more about the Inclusion Advisory Board? Who's on the board? What's its remit? And any tips you might have for organisations that wish to establish a similar kind of board?
Very happy to share this, because I think it's been a real success for us. We put in place this Inclusion Advisory Board about 3 years ago, so it's now in its second term. And what we did was we set it up alongside the board. So the Inclusion Advisory Board is, it has 12 members, and they are from all diverse strands. People can apply to be on the Inclusion Advisory Board, all different levels within the organisation. You need to say why you want to be on it, and then you're selected by a selection panel. And what you do with that 12 is I'm not involved in that at all. It's an Inclusion Advisory Board to improve the inclusive decision-making of our current board. So our current board might have a challenge or a conundrum that they want to talk to a broader group about, and they want to get diverse perspectives before they make a decision. So the CEO and the head of people and brand sit on that board with 12, and they will ask their questions and they'll get opinions. For example, we just changed our values recently, and our head of people took the values to the board to get opinions about it before they launched it further and took more views on it. So it's a collaborative way of establishing where there might be blind spots, where they might not have thought about something, and it's also brilliant development for people. So they're on it for 2 years, and then they rotate off, and then other people apply. They tend to be high performing individuals, and they tend to be people that are looking for broad experience and broader exposure. So it's a brilliant way of just developing your diverse talent as well.
Brilliant. Jen, you've been so generous with your insights, with your ideas. I think so much rich territory for people to go over here to get inspiration, start to think about what they might put in place. So thank you so much for your time.
Okay.
Time always flies by, but we've had our half an hour. I've checked to see if there are any questions. If you're watching on replay, then please do continue the conversation in the comments. Myself, Jen, Sharon, our founder at Shape Talent, we all have eyes on this. Jen, where's the best place for people to get in touch with you? Here on LinkedIn?
Absolutely, yeah, please do link in with me. And I tend to share quite a lot on LinkedIn, so very happy for people to follow and connect and get in touch that way. It'd be great.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Forbes report, which might be something that people want to look up and get. Maybe we can share that in the comments as well. But thank you so much for your time.
Welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Just a reminder that if you want to pick any of this up with Shape Talent as well, you can connect with us. We have our company page, or Sharon Peake, our founder, who I've mentioned, is always delighted to engage in conversation, because we are a consultancy that works with complex multinational organizations who are serious about gender equality and what it can achieve, exactly what we've been talking about with Jen here, for their business. This isn't a nice to have, this is a need to have. This has real impact and affects the bottom line. So really important. And no LinkedIn Live next month. We're having a little feet up for August, but we will see you again in September. So do look out for our next LinkedIn Live and who our guest will be. And in the meantime, if you miss us in August, you can go back over our back catalogue. We've got 7 other LinkedIn Lives. Some of them I spoke about a little bit earlier, covering a whole ream of topics in the DE&I space. So thank you for that. Thank you, Jen. And we'll look forward to you again in September. Bye-bye, everyone.
Cheers, bye.